People say the Verath's cradle had no lock. They are technically correct and practically useless. There was no keyhole, no code panel, no biometric scanner, no electromagnetic seal that any instrument in the colony's possession could find. 6 colonial archivists had pressed every surface of that lower bay door over the course of 140 years and found nothing. No seam, no mechanism, no apparent means of entry. The Council's engineering board had filed 17 formal reports on the subject. Their consistent conclusion was that the sealed bay either contained nothing of value or that whatever lay inside was not intended to be opened by anyone currently living. They were right on the second count. They just had the reason wrong. My name is Donald Veth. For 11 years, I worked the colony mess on the second deck of the Verath's Cradle. The ship, I mean, not the sealed chamber within it. The ship is what the early colonists named their whole settlement. The great grounded vessel that carried the first 800 people to this margin of the outer reach. She hasn't flown in 140 years. She sits on the flat of Verath's plateau with her landing struts sunk 3 meters into the rock and her lower deck swallowed by the slow creep of the settlement that grew around her over generations. Shops and offices and housing blocks lean against her hull, now like children pressing against the legs of an enormous parent who no longer moves. Her upper decks are still in colonial use, administration, medical, archives, the mess where I worked. Her lower decks are sealed. I was the second cook. That means I was the man who arrived before the head cook and left after him, who sourced the day's provisions from the cold stores on deck 4 each morning, who kept the prep surfaces clean and the rotational stock logged, and the morning count accurate when the records people failed to update the population register after the latest settlement expansion, which they did reliably every 6 to 8 months. I fed the colony's day shift workers their morning and midday meals. I knew a few of them by name from years of daily contact. Most of them knew me as the one who ladled the stew and topped up the grain portions and made sure the serving line moved at a pace that let people get back to their stations without being late. I was not invisible exactly. That would overstate the drama of my situation. I was simply the kind of person that a functioning colony produces in quantity. Reliable, present, competent at something specific, not ambitious in any direction that made anyone uncomfortable. The colony needed cooks more than it needed another voice in the council chambers, and I had known that from my first year and made my peace with it long before my 11th. I did not know the history of my family in any useful detail. I knew my mother's name was Sarah Veth and that she had worked maintenance on the upper decks until her knees gave out sometime in my early adolescence, and I knew her mother before her had been a colony regular of the ordinary sort, and I knew that her grandmother, my great-great-grandmother, Arla, had been one of the colony's earliest registered settlers, arriving in the second wave when the colony was still living out of the ship's cargo bays. I knew we had a family name, and that the name was old enough that Pesset in the archives had once mentioned it when I filed a routine records query, saying only that the Veth name appeared early in the register. I had not thought much about it. Names on the frontier are often old and rarely mean anything you can spend. I did not know, I want to be very clear about this, that the name Veth appeared in the ship's original manifest, not as a colonist, not as a crew member, as something else entirely. What I knew on the morning this story begins was that Mess Supervisor Gorin had sent me down to the cold stores on Deck 4 for a supplemental case of preserved grain, because the morning count run was running 15% higher than logged, and someone in records had once again failed to update the population register after the last settlement expansion. I had made that walk perhaps 200 times in 11 years. It was not a memorable errand. The cold stores on Deck 4 were organized well. The lighting was reliable if dim. The floor was the same dense composite as everywhere else below Deck 2. And the whole experience of going down there was defined primarily by the temperature drop between Deck 3 and Deck 4, which was enough to require a coat in the winter months. Deck 4 is the last occupied deck. Below it is the sealed section, 5 decks of the ship's lower hull that the colonial engineers had stripped of what useful equipment they could. Reached during the colony's first 3 years before the lower access doors sealed themselves in what the engineering board's founding report had described as an apparently autonomous lock event of undetermined origin. The sealing had been a minor crisis at the time, then a bureaucratic nuisance as the engineers filed their initial reports and failed to resolve the situation, and then, slowly, over the course of several colonial administrations, a settled fact of life that everyone simply accepted. The lower decks were sealed. The Cradle Bay was down there, somewhere in that sealed section, known only from the ship's original blueprint documentation that had been found in the upper deck archives. Once a generation, the council would appoint someone to try again. They would fail again, and the report would be filed and shelved. I took the cargo lift to deck 4, pulled the supplemental grain from the 3rd cold store aisle, loaded it onto a transport cart, and was wheeling it back toward the lift when the cart's front wheel caught on a floor seam. A gap that had been widening for months and that I had filed a maintenance request about twice without result. And the whole load tilted. I grabbed the nearest handhold to keep from going down with it, because a crate of preserved grain landing on your foot in a cold store is a particular kind of unpleasantness, and the nearest handhold was the wall. Specifically, it was the inner hull, which on deck 4 is also the outer wall of the sealed lower section. The hull is a dark material, some composite the original builders used that. The colony's metallurgists have spent considerable time analyzing over the years without arriving at a complete characterization. Dense and faintly warm to the touch, even in the cold store air, which always struck the engineers as anomalous, and which the metallurgical report had described as a thermal signature inconsistent with passive heat retention from the adjacent occupied decks. I had pressed my palm against it a dozen times over the years without thinking about it. You put your hand out when you are falling. You do not think about what you are touching. This time was different. I held the wall with one hand and caught the cart with the other, and I stood there for a moment catching my breath, and I felt something I had never felt before. It was not heat, exactly. It was more like the wall recognized the pressure of my hand, a very faint vibration, almost below the threshold of feeling, like a held note too low to hear but just barely possible to sense through the skin of the palm, running up through the heel of the hand and fading before it reached the wrist. I stood there for a full 3 seconds after stabilizing the cart, just holding contact, trying to determine whether what I was feeling was real or a product of the particular stillness that comes from a near fall and the adrenaline behind it. The vibration was real. It was faint, but it was real, and it was steady. Not a vibration in the mechanical sense. Nothing humming or cycling behind the wall, but something more like a responsive quality, as though the wall was aware that it was being touched, and by what? I thought I had imagined it. I steadied the cart, reloaded the grain, and went back to the lift. I did not tell anyone. There was nothing specific to tell. I had touched a wall and felt something I could not clearly describe, and the description I had would have sounded like the report of a man who had almost dropped a load of grain and startled himself in a cold storage bay. In 11 years of working in a sealed colony ship, you feel many things you cannot easily explain. The metal has its moods. The hull breathes differently in cold seasons. The lower decks have a quality of resonance that the upper occupied decks lack because there is nothing below to absorb or redirect the structural harmonics. I had dismissed stranger sensations than this one, but I noticed, the days that followed, that I thought about it more than I expected to. Not obsessively. I am not by temperament an obsessive man. It was more that the memory kept surfacing at odd moments, with a persistence that was not quite intrusive, but was not quite ordinary either. Standing at the prep counter, working through the morning's vegetable allocation. Lying in my bunk at the end of a shift, going over the next day's inventory in my head. walking the deck 2 corridor at change of shift. Each time the memory came back, it carried that same specific quality. The wall had felt attentive, not passive, not inert, not merely warm. Attentive, as though the wall had noticed me back in some way I could not account for. On the third day after the accident, I went down to deck 4 again, not on any assigned errand. I had no particular reason to be there, and Supervisor Gorin had not sent me. I stood in front of the cargo lift door on deck 2 at the end of my afternoon shift, holding my coat because I had been about to leave, and I found that I had pressed the button for deck 4 before I had made any conscious decision to do so. When the lift opened, I walked through the cold store to the inner hull and put my hand flat on the wall. The vibration came immediately this time. No lag, no gradual build. It was there the moment my palm made contact, the same subaudible hum I had felt 3 days earlier, but stronger. And now running further, not just through my palm, but up the length of my forearm to the elbow. A distributed feeling of resonance that was unmistakably a response and not a coincidence of standing posture or body temperature. A line of faint light traced itself along a seam in the hull, maybe 15 centimeters to the left of my hand. I watched it appear. It was pale amber, barely brighter than the ambient deck lighting, and it traveled along the seam for a distance of perhaps 40 centimeters before, fading over a period of 4 seconds. I stood there for a long time after it faded, my hand still on the wall. The cold store quiet around me, the hum of the deck 4 climate system the only sound, the smell of sealed provisions and old metal in the air. I went back 4 days after that, then 3 days, then 2, then every day for a week. I tell this as a sequence of returns because that is what it was, not a heroic march toward discovery. Not a systematic investigation with instruments and a research protocol, but a man who could not stop going back to a wall. Each visit the response grew slightly more definite, a longer trace of light with each return, the amber line extending further along its seam before fading. A vibration that I could now feel traveling not just up my forearm, but into my shoulder if I pressed with both palms flat. A resonance that was moving through my whole upper body when I held contact long enough. Once, on what I count as the 7th return, a sound, barely audible, felt more in the molars and the chest cavity than heard through the ears. A single low tone that rose and held for perhaps 2 seconds, and then released. I told no one. I had nothing to tell that would sound credible. A vibration in a cold storage wall, a line of amber light, a tone that was more felt than heard. The second cook's report of anomalous sensations in the inner hull would have generated, at best, a brief and skeptical entry in the maintenance log and a follow-up visit from someone with an instrument that would find exactly what every other instrument had found in 140 years of examination: a wall. On the 9th return, I brought a light because the cold stores are dim and I wanted to see the hull surface clearly, in direct illumination, rather than working by inference and palm feel. What the light showed me was a pattern that the ambient deck lighting had been too diffuse and too indirect to reveal in 11 years of my working 10 meters from this wall. It was not a crack. The composite was perfectly intact, not damaged, not degraded, not showing any sign of the kind of structural fatigue that would concern an engineer. But the surface carried a system of very fine lines pressed into it, each approximately the width of a stylus mark and less than half a millimeter deep, the depth at which they would be invisible to indirect lighting but clearly legible to a direct beam held within arm's reach. The lines ran in a repeating lattice that covered an area roughly the width and height of a standard doorway. They were smooth, the same temperature as the surrounding material, and they formed a pattern that was too regular to be accidental and too complex to be a manufacturing artifact. I traced the edges of the pattern with my fingertip. The lattice held a structure I recognized, after some time studying it, as organizational, not decorative, not purely geometric, but a system with repeating units and border markings, and what appeared to be field divisions, like a form, like a record displayed in an unfamiliar notation. I had been standing within arm's reach of this wall for 11 years. The recognition of that fact took a moment to settle. Not dramatic, just the quiet weight of a thing you cannot unknow. I had walked past this surface twice a day, 5 days a week for 11 years, in the same dim light that made it look like every other meter of inner hull on deck 4. The information had been there. I simply had not had the light or the proximity to see it. I went to the ship's archives on my next day off, which fell 2 days after the lattice discovery. The archive is on deck 3, a long room with good natural light from the Cradle's upper-level windows and rows of physical storage that supplement the digital records. Pesset runs it with the thoroughness of someone who regards the preservation of documentation as a moral commitment rather than a professional function. She has cataloged everything the colony has generated in 40 years of her tenure, and a significant portion of what was generated before her arrival. And she knows the collection the way a longtime resident knows a city, not just the streets but the side streets, the shortcuts, the places where the map has not been updated to reflect how things actually are. The duty archivist was Pesset, who had worked records for 30 years and regarded most of the colony's population with the professional neutrality of someone who has been asked every conceivable question about the ship's history and has learned not to show surprise at any of them. I told her I was interested in reading the original manifest of the Verath's Cradle, the ship's commissioning records, the passenger register, the full cargo listing. She gave me the look she reserved for people asking questions she had answered before, and she pulled the files without comment or question, which is one of the things I had always appreciated about Pesset. The original manifest was in an older notation system, the standard administrative script of the Outer Reach Survey Authority from 150 years ago, using a set of abbreviations and organizational conventions that were no longer in common use, and that I had to ask her twice to help me decode. The funding sections in particular used a set of financial and legal abbreviations that had not been standard for 80 years, and the compact documentation used terms from the hereditary lineage law of the early settlement era that I had no background in at all. Pesset translated without comment or visible curiosity, which I appreciated more than I would have been able to express at the time. I worked through the documents over 4 hours, taking notes in a small personal log I carry in my coat pocket. I moved carefully, not skimming, because I had learned from 11 years of inventory work that the detail you skip on a first pass is often the one that matters. I read the crew register, the passenger register, the cargo manifest, and then the commissioning section, which was the longest and most complex, running through the financial arrangements and authority structures under which the ship had been built and launched. What I found in the commissioning section was a structure I had not anticipated. The Verath's Cradle had been commissioned under joint authority. The Survey and Settlement Directorate was one signatory, the colonial authority that authorized and funded the expedition, as was standard. But the other signatory was a family trust, a hereditary lineage compact of the kind that had been common in the early settlement era, when wealthy founding families or organized lineage groups would contribute a significant portion of a ship's build cost in exchange for certain designated rights over the vessel and its contents in perpetuity. The nature of those rights varied considerably by compact. Some were property rights, inheritance claims over cargo or territory. Some were governance seats in whatever settlement authority developed, and some of the oldest and most elaborate, dating to an era before the survey authority had standardized its contract language, were custodial rights, the right to hold certain designated elements of the ship and its mission in trust for the recognized heirs of the founding line, with conditions of access that the compact itself defined and that superseded the survey authority's standard access protocols. The family trust on the Verath's Cradle commissioning manifest was listed as the Veth Compact. I sat with that for a very long time. Pesset watched me from her desk with the expression of an archivist who has learned not to insert herself into the moment when a researcher finds something they were not expecting. Was there always a family called Veth in the colony? I asked her, because I did not quite trust my own memory on this point, and the archive would know better than I did. From the second landing wave, she said. Your grandmother's grandmother, if the register is right. Arla Veth. She's in the original settlement record as a second wave arrival. What about before that? Was there a Veth in the first wave, in the ship's crew? Pessit turned to her terminal without a word and ran the query. She was thorough. She ran it 3 ways before she answered. No Veth in the first wave, she said. No Veth in the crew register. The Veth name appears first in the colony record with Arla, second wave, arriving approximately 14 months after the initial landing party. Is there a record of the Veth Compact's membership? The founding family's roster. She looked at me for a moment with a slightly different quality of attention. The look of someone who is updating their assessment of a conversation. Then she turned back to the terminal and searched. 4 minutes, 3 different query approaches. When she turned back, she said, not in the colony archive. The founding compact's membership roster would have been held in the ship's own systems. Compact records were typically kept aboard in protected storage rather than transferred to settlement records. The ship's own systems are in the sealed section. The sealed section. I thanked her for her help, asked her not to mention the query to anyone for the moment, and left. I walked back up to Deck 2 through the archive corridor, past the administrative offices, past the medical intake window, past the section of upper hull that carried 2 small observation ports, looking out over the plateau. The afternoon light outside was the plateau's particular gray gold in the cold season, flat and wide and honest. I stopped at one of the ports and looked out over the settlement for a moment. The roof lines pressing close against the Cradle's hull, the supply road running toward the eastern transit station, the plateau surface beyond the settlement boundary, flat and cold and enormous. Somewhere in the ground below the floor I was standing on, 140 years of waiting was about to end. I did not feel grand about it. I felt the specific gravity of a responsibility that had been waiting in my name, through my name, without my knowledge, for longer than any of the people currently alive in this colony had been alive. I felt the weight of that, and I decided, standing at that observation port in the gray gold afternoon, that I was going to handle it correctly, the same way I handled the inventory and the prep work and the morning count. With attention, without shortcuts. Starting at the beginning and working through to the end. I should say something here about the colony and about my place in it, because it matters to what comes next. Verath's plateau is not a glamorous settlement. It is a working colony, functional, durable, not much given to mythology or ceremony. The people who built it and the people who maintain it are practical by disposition and by necessity. The plateau's climate runs to cold and dry in most seasons. The soil requires amendment before it yields anything useful. And the distances between the Cradle settlement and the next nearest colony world are significant enough that self-sufficiency is not a philosophy, here but an engineering constraint. We do not lack for things. We have what we built, and we maintain what we have. And that is the rhythm of life on the plateau, year after year, generation after generation. In that rhythm, the mess was a fixed point. The settlement's workers ate at regular hours, and they came to the mess for the morning and midday meals because the alternative, preparing food in individual quarters on a colonial schedule, was less efficient and less reliable. And everyone had learned that from the early days. The mess on Deck 2 of the Cradle was not a restaurant. It was an institution. And like all institutions, it ran on the labor of people who were committed to its daily function without any particular expectation of recognition. Goran ran it. I ran the half of it that Goran did not run. We did not discuss this arrangement often because it did not require discussion. It was simply what we did, day after day. And the work was good work, and I had chosen it with my eyes open. I had chosen it, in fact, in part because of the ship. I know that sounds strange given that I had never been below Deck 4, but there is a quality to working inside the Verath's Cradle that is different from working in any of the colony's surface buildings. A sense of age and weight and deep intention that the rock and prefab construction of the settlement above never quite carries. The ship was built with a seriousness of purpose that you can feel in its materials, in the exactness of its joints, in the quality of its climate management systems that have operated without significant failure for 140 years, when most colonial equipment of comparable age would have been replaced 2 or 3 times over. Working inside it was, for me, a kind of daily contact with something built to last. I found that steadying. I did not have a more articulate reason than that, and I never tried to find one. What I am saying is that when the archive produced the Veth Compact's commissioning clause, the revelation was not only genealogical. It was that the thing I had found steadying my whole adult working life, the ship, its age, its quality, the sense of being inside something built with very long intention, had been built, at least in part, by my family, by a lineage I carried in my bloodwork without knowing it. The steadiness I had been drawing from the ship for 11 years had a source, and the source was mine. I am not a man who moves quickly on conclusions. I do not think of myself as overly cautious. Caution implies a fear of being wrong, and it was not fear that made me wait 3 more days before going back to the hull. It was the weight of understanding that you have found something real. When a thing is impossible, it can be brushed against and dismissed. When a thing is beginning to look credibly true, you slow down because the implications carry mass, and mass takes time to hold properly. I spent the 3 days doing my job and thinking clearly about what I actually knew and what I was inferring. What I knew. A family compact bearing the name Veth had co-commissioned the Verath's Cradle, with designated rights over elements of the vessel. A woman named Arla Veth had arrived in the second wave, not the first, coming to the ship rather than with it, and her line had continued in the colony, ending with me. The inner hull of the sealed section's doorway carried a system of fine-line records in the compact's notation. The hull had responded to my touch in ways it had not responded to anyone else in recorded memory. What I was inferring, the compact's custodial rights related to the Cradle Bay specifically. The response system was biometric, keyed to the Veth bloodline's signature, rather than any external credential. The compact's sealed records would explain what the bay contained and what the designated heir was meant to do with it. On the 4th day I went back. I pressed both palms flat on the lattice-patterned section of hull. The resonance came up immediately. Full and distributed now through both arms and into my chest, the strongest response yet, with a quality that I had come to think of as impatient, not frustrated, not urgent, but with the character of something that has been waiting a very long time and finds the waiting less comfortable than it once did. The amber line light appeared along the doorway seam, then extended further than it ever had. The full perimeter of the doorway shape, floor to ceiling, all 4 edges illuminated, defining a door that had been there for 140 years and had simply been impossible to see. Without the right angle of light and the right conditions of approach. I pressed harder, not dramatically, not with force. The kind of steady even pressure you use on a door you are not sure is open, testing the resistance, feeling for the mechanism. The tone came, louder than it had ever been, still below the upper threshold of comfortable hearing, but unmistakably present, a held low note that rose through a pattern of 3 pulses, held, then 3 again, then resolved. A repeating structure that was too organized to be mechanical resonance, and too deliberate to be ambient harmonic. A question, I was certain of it. Not a linguistic question in any language I could parse, but a question in the broader sense. An inquiry with an expected structure of response, a system waiting for the right input. I did not know the notation. I did not know the compact's language or its protocols. I stood there with my palms on a door that had been sealed for 140 years, in a cold storage deck 2 levels below the mess where I had worked for 11 years, and I arrived at the only true thing I had left. "I don't know what you need from me," I said, out loud, to the door. I am aware of how that sounds. The tone shifted. 2 pulses, a pause, 2 pulses. Different from the 3 and 3 pattern. Shorter, with a different spacing. I don't have a key, I said. I don't have a code. I don't have the compact's documentation. Whatever the founding family held, it's behind this door. I don't know the words you're looking for. 1 pulse, a pause, then quiet. I stood there in the quiet for a long time, and then I said the only remaining true thing, the thing that was left when I had exhausted every practical option. My name is Donald Veth. I work 2 decks above you. I've been coming back here because I couldn't stop. I don't know why you noticed me. I don't know if I'm the right person, but I'm the one who kept coming back. The amber light along the seam went white. Not bright, not blinding or dramatic. White the way an overcast midday sky is white, full and diffuse and impossible to locate a source for. As though the composite itself was converting from absorption to emission across its entire surface. The door pulled inward by roughly 2 centimeters on a mechanism I could not hear, and would not, in any examination I conducted afterward, be able to locate or explain. Then it stopped. I put my hands on the edge and pulled. The lower bay smelled of sealed air, cold, clean in a way that no recycled colony atmosphere ever quite manages, carrying the particular quality of air that has been held completely still for a very long time in a very tight space. A stillness you can taste, mineral and faintly metallic and absent of the biological compounds that accumulate in any space where people breathe and move. The lights came on as I stepped inside, not all at once but in sequence, each panel waking as I moved forward, giving me enough light to see the space without flooding it. The system was reading my position and illuminating ahead of me, dark behind, as though conserving something or respecting something about the way this space was meant to be entered. What was in the bay was what I can only call a cradle. I know no better word for it. It was not a single object. It was a chamber within the chamber. A nested structure roughly circular and perhaps 8 meters across, built from the same dense dark composite as the hull. Within it, arranged in a pattern I later counted as 12 positions, were raised oval platforms, each roughly the length and width of a person, each shaped in the shallow curve of something designed to receive a human form. Some held sealed containers, not crates, not cargo cases, but objects built with a precision and care that set them immediately apart from any colonial manufacture I had ever seen. Curved, seamless, carrying that same amber to white luminescence through their surfaces that the door had shown, a light that came from within the material rather than from any surface source. Others were empty. 11 of the 12 platforms were occupied. 1 was bare and dark. I walked the perimeter slowly, not touching anything, taking in the space. The floor of the bay was clean of the dust that covers every other horizontal surface in the sealed decks. The air in here had been too still, or the material itself repelled particulate matter. I could not determine which. The occupied platforms held their contents in a state of keeping that I recognized as active even before I had any framework for understanding what I was looking at. The light through each surface was steady, not pulsing, and it carried a warmth that was distinct from any thermal phenomenon. You could feel it if you held your hand near the surface, not heat as such, but presence. The quality of something attended to, maintained, kept. Each platform felt occupied the way a room with a sleeping person in it feels different from an empty room before you have seen the occupant. Something alive was in here. 11 somethings held, quiet, waiting. I did not touch any of them. I completed the circle and came to the center of the chamber, where a structure rose to approximately chest height. Not quite a pillar in the architectural sense. It was faceted, 6-sided, each face carrying a version of the fine-line lattice I had found on the outer hull. But more complex here, more dense. The lines formed nested patterns on each face, a central design surrounded by successive rings of smaller markings. And the material between the lines was not fully opaque but translucent, as though the composite grew thinner at those points, allowing light from behind it to read through. When I put my hand on the column, the translucent areas brightened. It came up slowly and deliberately, the pace of a system choosing how to reveal itself, not the pace of an electrical response. The light rose to a stable level and held, and then the column's facets began to show content. The fine-line lattice was not decorative. The lines were the organizing borders of a record system. Fields arranged not alphabetically or chronologically, but in the structure of a genealogical tree, the roots at the column's base and the branches rising through successive generations to the upper faces. An old tree, a very deep tree. The lowest levels of its branching were so fine and numerous that I could not read individual entries, only the mass of the structure. Generations of lineage spreading upward, narrowing and narrowing as it rose, as lines ended and branches converged. Near the top of the tree, on the face that carried the brightest light, the last living branch showed two terminal nodes. The left node was dark, no light, no warmth, signaling whatever the compact's notation used for an ended line. The right node was the brightest single point in the entire column, brighter than any other element, lit with a quality that was clearly distinguished from the steady ambient glow of the rest of the record. It was marked with a symbol rather than a name I could read, a stylized double-line character that I had seen once before, in the archive, in the margin annotation of the Verath compact's commissioning clause, where Pesset had told me it was the compact's seal mark, the notation for designated heir under the compact's hereditary succession terms. I stood there looking at it for a long time. Then the column spoke. It did not have a voice in the way a person has a voice. It produced a tonal system, a quality of sound that was recognizably communicative rather than mechanical, carrying the intent of language in the architecture of its modulation rather than in any vocabulary I knew. I should not have been able to understand it. By any rational account, I did not know this system, had never been exposed to it, had no framework for parsing it, but I did parse it, not through any cognitive process I could identify, not through decoding or translation, but through the same direct channel by which a very deep emotion produces understanding before the mind has found its words. I received what the column said the way you receive music, not as decoded information, but as arrived fact. What it said was this: forgotten here, the cradle holds. I stood there. The column's light held steady at its settled level. The 11 occupied platforms continued their quiet keeping on the outer ring of the chamber. The empty platform waited in its place, dark and bare. I want to describe what that moment felt like, because I have since been asked, and because honesty requires an attempt at it. It did not feel triumphant. It did not feel like the moment in stories where the chosen person straightens their spine and looks into the middle distance with a gathering sense of destiny. It felt like the moment when you learn something true about yourself that has always been true, that various surrounding systems have always known, and that you have simply not been in possession of. The feeling not of discovery, but of correction, a long error finally resolved. I was not a great man. I held no illusions on that point. I was a colonial mess cook of middling reputation and 11 years of competent, unremarkable service. My palms were calloused. My boots were the supply depot's bulk line. I had no enemies of any significance and no particular champions, and I had been, in the estimation of the colony and the bulk of the people in it, exactly what I appeared to be: a man who did a necessary job well and without fanfare, who could be relied on to be there when the shift started and to still be there when it ended, who asked nothing from the colony's social architecture beyond a bunk and a decent kit and the knowledge that tomorrow's prep work was accounted for. But I was also, as the column's bright node was telling me, the last living registered heir of the Verath compact, the founding lineage that had contributed the majority of the Verath's Cradle's original build cost and retained custodial rights over the sealed lower bay in perpetuity. The bay had been waiting for a Verath to claim access, not through any external credential, but through the compact's own biometric registration, a signature encoded into the Verath bloodline itself in the founding era, detectable only by the system the compact had built into the hull. Arla had arrived in the second wave because the first wave's arrival had gone wrong. In some way the colony's records did not capture, and the ship had sealed before her branch of the Veth line could reach the bay. Then her line had worked and married and raised children in a frontier colony for 5 generations, and the bay had kept waiting, and none of them had come back to press a palm to the hull in the particular way that the system was looking for. I do not fully understand why I did. I have thought about this carefully, and I do not have an explanation that fully satisfies me. I know the first contact was accidental, a cart tipping, a hand reaching for the nearest surface. I know that whatever the hull's recognition system detected in that first contact was enough to shift something from long dormancy into active, waiting. And I know that after that initial response, I kept returning because the feeling of being noticed, genuinely noticed, by something old and patient and attentive, was, for a man who had spent 11 years being the person people relied on without registering, something I found very difficult to leave alone. The experience of being recognized is its own gravity. Perhaps that quality, the returning, the showing up regardless, the inability to walk away from a thing that was asking for attention, even when the asking was too quiet for most people to hear, was itself part of what the compact had encoded. I do not know. I know only that whatever the cradle had been waiting for, I had it. I stood in that bay for a long time after the column fell silent. When I finally moved, I walked the perimeter of the platforms one more time, counted them carefully. 11 occupied, 1 empty. Each of the occupied platforms continued its steady light, unhurried, as though the contents had waited 140 years, and the addition of another hour was entirely unremarkable. Whatever was held in those sealed containers, I had theories, careful ones, that I held loosely and have since revised. It was being kept with a precision and consistency that the colony's best engineers, working with full budget allocation, could not have matched over that span of time with any technology currently available on Verath's plateau. The compact's founders had built something still working perfectly after a century and a half. That was the fact I kept returning to as I stood there. I stood in that bay for a long time after the column fell silent. Not from shock. I want to be precise about the quality of the stillness. It was not paralysis, and it was not overwhelm. It was the particular stillness of a person who has received a large fact and is letting it settle to its correct level before moving. Because to move before it has settled is to risk losing track of what is true and what is reaction. What the column had said, forgotten here, the cradle holds, was not a command. It was not an instruction. It was a statement of fact in 2 parts, the status of the heir and the status of the cradle. The heir had been forgotten. That was accurate. 5 generations of frontier life had covered the Veth name's significance until no one carrying it knew what the name was attached to. And the cradle had held. That was also accurate, visibly, demonstrably, undeniably accurate, given the 11 platforms and their quiet, steady glow around me. The column was not claiming I was extraordinary. It was noting that I was present, and that the compact's record showed me as the current endpoint of the recognized line, and that the cradle's function, whatever the full scope of that function turned out to be, was intact and waiting. Nothing more, nothing less. It was, I thought, the most honest sentence anyone or anything had ever addressed to me. I looked at the 11 occupied platforms for a long time. Whatever they contained, whoever I had begun to think, given the human-shaped platforms and the quality of active keeping, they had been held here, in perfect condition for a span of time that made the colony's entire history look like a brief interruption. The compact's founders had built a keeping system robust enough to function without maintenance, without resupply, without any external input for 140 years, and apparently considerably more before the colony arrived. They had built it with the expectation, I understood this clearly, standing in the middle of it, that the heir would be late, not just delayed by circumstance, but potentially very late, potentially arrived after generations of ordinary life had completely buried the memory of the compact. They had built for that contingency. They had built for the heir who did not know they were the heir, who came back by instinct rather than instruction. They had built it for exactly the situation I represented. The thought of founders who had envisioned this specific failure mode and designed around it, who had trusted that the Veth line would eventually produce someone who came back to a wall they could not explain their own connection to, carried a weight that I had to stand under for a while before I could move again. I thought about what it meant to build something with that kind of patience built into it, to construct a system not for your own use, but for the use of a descendant you would never meet, who would arrive at an unknown time, who might come having forgotten everything, and to make that system robust enough that the forgetting didn't matter, that the returning was enough, that the showing up was sufficient qualification. I had spent 11 years doing my job in a colony that would have found a replacement for me within a week if I had stopped. I do not say that bitterly. It is simply the reality of being one of the necessary, unremarkable people that any functioning settlement requires in quantity. The work I did was important in the way that every act of daily maintenance is important. If it stops, things break. But it was not important in the sense of being noticed or valued above the line of ordinary recognition. I had always understood that. I had made my peace with it in my early years on the job and had not revisited the peace since. But the founders of this compact had built a system that waited for exactly this person. Not for a great one. Not for someone who remembered. For someone who came back. For someone who could not leave a thing alone that was quietly asking for attention. I walked to the inner wall panel before leaving. Beside the door, on the interior surface, the fine-line lattice appeared again in a compressed form. A smaller version of the column's tree, the size of a page, showing the same genealogical structure at reduced scale. At the base was the compact seal mark. At the top was the bright node. And below the bright node in the compact's notation was a line I had not found on the column's face. Not a name, a function, a designation. 3 characters in the founding notation followed by a symbol I recognized because I had seen it in the Survey Authority's general reference on hereditary custodial compacts in a footnote on founding-era lineage terms that I had almost not read. Warden of the Cradle. That was what the empty platform was for. I walked out of the bay. The door closed behind me silently. The seam lines faded back to their invisible depth within seconds. By the time I reached the cargo lift, the hull wall behind me looked as it always had, dark composite, flush and featureless, warm to the touch in the cold deck air. I rode the lift back to deck 2. I went to my bunk. I sat on the edge of it for a long time with my hands on my knees, the specific posture of a man who has received information he needs to hold before he can act on it. The next morning I woke early, made the mess's pre-service prep as I always did, arranged the grain and the morning rotation and the protein portions for the colony's early shift workers. And when Supervisor Gorin arrived, I told him I needed to speak to someone from the council's archivist board. Today. He gave me the scheduling problem look, and I told him it was not about the mess. And he filed the request without further argument. 3 days later, I was sitting across from a colonial archivist named Drev and a representative from the engineering board named Sastav in a meeting room on deck 3, explaining what I had found. I brought the manifest documentation. I explained the Veth compact and the commissioning clause. I laid out the biometric signature theory carefully, framing it as theory while noting that the ship's own systems appeared to support it in a way that I would invite them to observe directly. I explained the sequence of returns, the progressive responses, the doorway illumination, the interior of the bay. Drev and Sastav listened without interrupting. When I finished, they looked at each other with the specific expression of 2 people having a conversation in their heads that they have not yet decided to have out loud. Sastav said, "You're telling us the sealed bay opened?" "Yes." "For you specifically?" "Yes." "Not for any of the engineering teams that have attempted access over the last 140 years. Not that the archive records." "No." Another long silence between them. "Can you take us down there?" Drev asked. "Yes," I said. "I want to. But I want you to understand something first." What's in that bay is not in the colony's inventory. It belongs to the Compact's record, and the Compact's custodial terms predate the Survey Authority's settlement charter for this site. The warden designation carries access rights that are not subordinate to the Colonial Council's standard inventory authority. I'm not raising this to be obstructive. I'm raising it because if we go down there and the engineering board begins cataloging the contents without that framework in place, we will create a legal situation that the colony's charter court will spend years working through, and whatever is on those platforms has already waited 140 years. I would prefer we do this correctly. There was a silence. Then Sostov said, "That's reasonable." Drev said, "We'll need to verify the lineage claim. PESA in the archive has the manifest documentation. The biometric component is more complex to verify through standard means, given that the Compact's notation is pre-standard. But the ship's own systems have accepted my identity, and I would suggest that is a piece of evidence worth weighing. The ship's systems have been sealed and inaccessible for 140 years, Drev said. Yes, I said, they have, and they opened for me. We went down that afternoon, the three of us. I put my hand on the wall. The seam lines came up in amber, then white, then the door opened. Drev made a sound I will not attempt to characterize. Sostov made no sound at all. She simply went still, with the complete focused attention of a person who has spent 30 years working on a problem and is watching the answer appear in front of her. Through inputs she did not predict. Inside, the column glowed. The 11 platforms kept their steady light. The empty platform waited in its position. I stood in the center and let them look, because looking was what this moment needed, and I was not going to rush it. Drev walked the perimeter twice. Sostov went to the column without touching it, reading the surface with her eyes, the way a skilled reader approaches a text in a language they know only partially. After a long silence, Drev turned to me and said, "How did you know to keep coming back? After the first contact, what told you to return?" I thought about it honestly before answering. Nothing told me, I said. It felt like it was noticing me. I found that very difficult to walk away from. Drev looked at the column for a moment. 140 years, she said, quietly. Not to me. I thought, to the room or to the weight of the thing we were standing inside. More than that, I said. The Compact is 140 years old by colony reckoning. The ship is older. Whatever the founders built down here, they built it to wait for longer than the colony has existed, Sostov said, still reading the column. It was waiting for you specifically. For a Veth, I said. I happened to be the last one the Compact's record shows. We stayed 2 hours. I showed them the warden designation on the inner wall panel, the seal mark in the commissioning record, the genealogical tree, and the active node. I did not speculate about the 11 occupied platforms. That question would generate its own process, and I wanted the legal framework established before that process started. On the lift back up, Sostov said, "Your life is going to be substantially different in about 3 days." "I expect so," I said. "Are you ready for it?" I thought about Arla Veth arriving in the second wave, knowing or not knowing what was here. I thought about my mother's maintenance shifts and her bad knees, and about 5 generations of ordinary frontier life folded over a Compact that had been waiting the whole time. I've been the person the colony didn't need to think about for 11 years, I said. I've had a great deal of time to think. Sostov looked at me. What did you think about? About what it means to hold something well, I said. For a long time. For people who are counting on you to do it right even when no one is checking. She was quiet for a moment. You cooked, she said. For 11 years. Yes, every day, whether or not anyone thanked you. That's the job, I said. The lift reached deck 2. The doors opened. I stepped out and held them for the others, because that was habit. The habit of the person who holds the door, who arrives first and leaves last, who does the work that needs doing whether or not it is noticed. It turned out that was the qualification. Not the blood alone, though the blood was what the system read. It was the blood of a line that had built something enormous and then receded from the recognition of it, that had committed to a trust for generations without certainty of return, that had seeded itself into the quiet work of a frontier life, and kept showing up without reward because that was what the compact had always required of the warden's line. I have not stopped making the mess's morning prep. I have not handed it to anyone else. There are larger things on my schedule now, the council meetings, the compact adjudication proceedings, the careful process of establishing what the 11 platforms contain and what the warden's full role entails in terms the colonial charter can recognize. All of that is real, and it is mine, and I am doing it with the same attention I brought to 11 years of inventory and prep work. But the morning prep grounds me. The warden's job, as I understand it now from the compact's records, which Drev and Pesset and I have been working through together for the past month, is to hold things, to be present, to return, to keep coming back to the thing that is asking for attention, even when the asking is quiet and the audience is no one. I have been doing that work my whole adult life without knowing it was the work. The Cradle recognized me. It did not tell me I was great, or powerful, or destined for anything that would make a conventional story. It said I was the forgotten heir that the Cradle held. Both of those things were simply true, stated by a system that did not embellish and did not console, and had waited 140 years to say them to the right person. The heir had been forgotten, not by the compact which had kept its record perfectly, but by the generations of ordinary living that had covered the Veth name in the ordinary dust of frontier survival until no one, including the Veths themselves, remembered what the name was attached to. The Cradle had held. Through every colonial administration, every engineering report, every generation that looked at the sealed lower decks and concluded there was nothing down there for them. It had held 11 somethings in perfect keeping for a span of time that dwarfs anything the colony has built or maintained, and it had kept the warden's record current and the access system active, and it had noticed me when I put my hand on its wall to catch myself from falling. I hold it now. That is the full extent of what I can tell you. I hold it. I will continue to hold it, and I will do the warden's work the same way I have done every other work that fell to me. Arriving when it needs arriving, staying when it needs staying, and going back the next day whether or not anyone is watching. The column glows in the sealed bay below deck 4. I know the way down.